I had always thought of myself as a rational person. One of those people who rolls their eyes at ghost stories and laughs off strange sounds as just the wind. So when I moved into my little house in a quiet town in Vermont, I didn't expect much more than a peaceful, uneventful life. The neighborhood was calm, lined with maple trees that swayed gently even in the slightest breeze, and every house had a bit of charm, even if some were a bit worn down. My neighbor's place, though, stood out from the rest. A tall, shadowed house with dark green siding, its windows always seemed to be shut tight, curtains drawn like the house had secrets to hide. Weeds sprouted in the yard, the grass was wildly overgrown, and it gave off an air of abandonment. I hadn't seen anyone come or go, not even a light flickering on inside at night. No mail on the porch, no car in the driveway, nothing. For all I knew, the place was empty. It was around the second week of settling in when I first heard it. A low, faint thudding noise, almost like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. I dismissed it initially, thinking it was some odd creak of the old house or a distant neighbor moving things around. But night after night, the sound continued. Sometimes it would be followed by a strange scraping, or what could have been a faint whisper. It wasn't loud, but once I'd noticed it, it was impossible to ignore. One night, after brushing my teeth and crawling into bed, the sound started up again, clearer this time, almost rhythmic. I sat up, squinting at the darkened window that faced the neighbor's house. The noise seemed to be coming from there, barely audible but distinct, pulsing in the stillness of the night. It didn't make sense. No one lived there, right? I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but a creeping sensation of unease began to settle in the back of my mind. The next morning, I took my coffee outside, hoping that maybe some fresh air would clear my thoughts. But as I looked over at the shadowed house next door, I felt that same prickling sense of something wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something hidden within those walls, something waiting. But that was ridiculous. It had to be. Another week went by, and the sounds didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder, as though whatever was making them was getting closer. By then, curiosity had settled in. It was gnawing at me, almost taunting me. I decided to look into the history of the house, just to satisfy my own mind that it was nothing. I asked around a bit, the coffee shop, the local library. People seemed reluctant to talk about it, and those who did said they knew little. All I got was that the house had been sold a few years back, but the owner had never moved in. When I asked if they'd heard anything strange from that house, people just stared at me blankly, as if I'd asked them something absurd. Still, the feeling that something was wrong there lingered. One night, I lay in bed, the sounds once again creeping into my consciousness. This time, though, they seemed closer, more pronounced. The scraping sounded almost as if it were just on the other side of the wall. Goosebumps pricked my skin, and I sat up, heart racing. The silence that followed was deafening, but I was too tense to move. My eyes locked onto the window that faced the neighbor's house. For the first time, I thought I saw a flicker of movement behind the curtains. Then, without warning, the noise stopped entirely. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence was so complete, it felt unnatural, pressing down on me like a weight. I took a shaky breath, trying to dismiss the dread pooling in my stomach. But that night, as I drifted into a fitful sleep, I dreamt of that house, of its windows staring blankly back at me, and something dark lurking behind those drawn curtains. The next day, I could hardly concentrate on my work, my mind drifting back to that silent, foreboding house. I felt pulled to it, as if it were silently calling for me to come closer. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight, I decided to investigate. The air was cold as I stepped out, and the night seemed darker than usual, the stars barely visible behind a thick layer of clouds. As I approached the house, my heart thudded painfully in my chest. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the closer I got, the colder the air around me seemed to become. I reached the porch and hesitated, my fingers hovering over the old wooden door. Just as I was about to knock, the faint sound returned, coming from somewhere below the house, like someone or something trying to reach out from deep inside. My hand trembled as I hovered by the door, every fiber of my being telling me to turn back. But that sound, the eerie scraping from beneath the house, held me there, almost like it was drawing me in. The stillness around me was unnatural, the air cold and thick, making it hard to breathe. After a few seconds, I stepped back from the porch, telling myself I was being foolish, that I'd imagined it all. Yet, that night, lying in bed, I couldn't get the house out of my mind. I lay awake listening, expecting to hear the noises from next door. But for the first time in weeks, there was only silence. It was as if the house knew I had tried to uncover its secrets and was taunting me with its quiet. Days passed, and I tried to shake off the strange experiences, focusing on work and my normal routine. But each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the house would cast long, dark shadows over my backyard. I felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to come back. I told myself it was my imagination, but the feeling of dread wouldn't leave. One evening, I saw an elderly man walking down the street. He seemed like he'd lived in the area a long time, and I thought maybe he'd know something about the mysterious house. Summoning my courage, I approached him and casually asked if he knew anything about the place. The man's expression darkened. He glanced over his shoulder toward the house, his gaze lingering for a moment before turning back to me. "No one's lived there for years," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not since, well, it doesn't matter. Just stay away from that house, son. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed." His words left a chill in me, but before I could ask more, he shuffled away, his shoulders hunched as if to escape whatever memory he'd stirred up. That night, the silence returned, but it felt different, almost oppressive. I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it again, a faint scraping sound, like fingernails against wood. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear. It was coming from the direction of the neighbor's house, but it was louder, more insistent this time, as if something was scratching its way to the surface. Driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, I slipped out of bed, grabbing my flashlight. The air was bitterly cold as I stepped outside, making me shiver. I approached the house again, my footsteps muffled by the damp grass. The sound grew louder, echoing through the night like a distant, eerie rhythm. I walked around to the back, finding a small cellar door half hidden under a layer of tangled vines and leaves. It was padlocked, but the metal was rusted and weak. I hesitated, my mind racing with questions. But the scratching grew louder, sharper, as if urging me to come closer. With a surge of determination, I pulled at the lock, and with a final snap, it broke. I swung the doors open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. I aimed my flashlight down the stairs, but the beam barely penetrated the gloom. Taking a deep breath, I began to descend, each step creaking ominously beneath me. As I reached the bottom, the smell hit me, a mix of mold, damp earth, and something else, something that made my stomach churn. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and an ancient dust-covered table stood against one wall, littered with items I couldn't make out in the dim light. I felt like I'd stepped back in time, into a forgotten part of the house where no one had been for years. And then, I saw it. A small door on the far side of the room, half hidden behind a stack of old, rotting crates. The scratching was louder now, almost frantic, coming from beyond that door. I swallowed hard, my heart thudding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, turning it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow passageway, barely wide enough to walk through. The scratching stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so thick I could hear my own breathing, ragged and unsteady. I stepped inside, shining the flashlight ahead. The walls were lined with old photographs, faded and yellowed with age. Some of them showed a family, a man, a woman, and a young child. They all looked so normal, so happy, but something about their eyes made me shiver. It was as if they were staring straight at me, pleading silently. And then, from the darkness ahead, I heard it, a faint, wheezing breath. My skin prickled as I realized I wasn't alone. I raised the flashlight, my hand trembling, and took a step forward. My eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light, but I could make out the shape of a figure hunched in the corner, barely moving. The figure shifted, letting out a low, guttural groan that made my blood run cold. It turned slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of its face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to sink into its skull. It stared at me, lips cracked and drawn back in what might have been a smile. or perhaps a grimace. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The figure shifted, reaching out a skeletal hand toward me, its eyes locked onto mine. I couldn't move, frozen by a terror so deep it felt like it was paralyzing me. Then, the figure spoke, its voice barely a whisper, but filled with a longing that chilled me to the bone. "I've been waiting for so long." The figure's words echoed in my ears, chilling and barely more than a whisper. "I've been waiting for so long." My mind raced, trying to process the impossible, but the terror held me in place. In the dim light, I could see the thin, bony arm reaching toward me, each movement strained and deliberate, as if it hadn't moved in years. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the weight of darkness pressed in around me. I forced myself to move, my back hitting the cold wall as I tried to retreat. My flashlight lay on the ground, its beam illuminating the edges of the cramped space and casting long, distorted shadows over the figure's frail form. The gaunt face twisted into a smile, a horrific mix of relief and desperation. It was then that I noticed the worn clothes hanging loosely on the figure's body, faded, torn remnants of what once might have been a shirt and pants. It was as though the person had been forgotten here, abandoned. Who are you?" I stammered, my voice barely audible. The figure's mouth opened, and a ragged, shuddering breath escaped. "They left me here, locked away, forgotten." The voice, though faint, was filled with a grief so deep that it made my skin crawl. It was like listening to a ghost, someone who had been removed from the world and left to wither away in silence. I took a step back, my gaze darting toward the open door of the cellar. I needed to leave, to escape from this nightmare. But as I moved, the figure's arm extended further, reaching out with fingers like claws, too thin and fragile, almost skeletal. The figure's eyes met mine, and for a moment I was trapped in that gaze, unable to look away. "Don't go," it pleaded, the voice cracking with desperation. "Don't leave me alone again." The weight of those words pulled at something inside me, a mix of fear and pity that left me paralyzed. This person, whoever they were, had been abandoned here, left to rot in darkness. But the longer I looked, the more I realized there was something else, something lurking beneath the sorrow in those hollow eyes. A flicker of something darker, a hunger that went beyond mere loneliness. A chill ran through me as I saw the figure begin to rise, slow and unsteady, leaning on the wall for support. The movements were unnatural, as if the muscles and joints hadn't been used in years. But there was a strength there, a determination that sent a wave of dread crashing over me. I backed away, inching toward the door, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. But as I turned to run, I felt a cold, clammy grip around my ankle. I looked down, heart pounding, to see the bony hand grasping me with surprising force. "Please," it rasped, the voice growing stronger, more insistent. "Stay with me. Don't leave me in the dark." The words sounded almost hypnotic, like a lullaby meant to keep me there, bound to this place. My mind screamed to break free, but my body felt rooted to the spot, held by a fear so deep it was as if the shadows themselves were wrapping around me, pulling me down. With a final surge of panic, I kicked my leg, breaking free from the grip. The figure stumbled, letting out a low, guttural moan that reverberated through the narrow passage. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight as I ran for the cellar stairs, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. As I reached the top, I risked one last glance over my shoulder. The figure was standing in the doorway of the narrow passage, its eyes locked onto mine with a gaze that promised it would never forget this betrayal. The expression on its face was no longer one of sorrow, but of anger, raw and unforgiving. I slammed the cellar doors shut and stumbled back onto the lawn, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. But even as I put distance between myself and the house, the feeling of those hollow eyes on me remained, etched into my mind like a scar. For days after, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the darkness, felt the icy grip around my ankle, heard that desperate whisper, "Don't leave me alone." The house next door was silent, almost as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew that whatever was down there was waiting, biding its time. A week later, I saw a moving truck pull up in front of the house. A family of 3 stepped out, their faces bright with excitement as they gazed up at their new home. I wanted to warn them, to tell them to run far away from this place, but the words caught in my throat. Who would believe a story like mine? So I watched, silent and helpless, as they moved in, laughing and smiling, unaware of the horrors lying just below their feet. And each night, as the darkness settled over the neighborhood, I lay awake, haunted by the knowledge that I had left something behind, something that would never forgive me for leaving it in the dark. And somewhere in that house, down in the cold, forgotten cellar, I could almost hear it, a faint, scratching sound, growing louder with each passing night. I've never been the kind to scare easily. Growing up, I was the kid who'd stay up late watching horror movies, laughing at the jump scares and rolling my eyes at ghost stories. But moving to a secluded house on the edge of town had brought out a different side of me, a side I hadn't expected. I'd lived in bustling apartments my whole life, surrounded by city lights and the constant hum of life. But when I finally got the chance to move out to a place of my own, somewhere quieter, I jumped at it. The house wasn't anything fancy, a two-bedroom place tucked away on a dead-end road, bordered by trees on one side and a gravel driveway leading up to it. It was peaceful, exactly what I thought I needed. My first few weeks there were blissfully uneventful. I'd get up, go to work, come home, and enjoy the silence. There were no neighbors close by, just miles of forest and a winding road that stretched out into the distance. At night, the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. It felt safe, almost too quiet, but I quickly grew used to it. Being alone in the house, I decided to set up some security cameras. Nothing fancy, just a few basic cameras around the exterior. One at the front door, one near the garage, and another overlooking the backyard. It was more for peace of mind than anything else. After all, it's not like anything ever happened in a town this small. Then, one night, something odd happened. I was doing my usual routine, checking the camera feeds on my laptop before bed. Just a quick glance, a habit I'd picked up since moving in. Everything looked normal. The front yard was empty, the driveway clear, and the backyard was quiet. But as I clicked through the feeds, my stomach dropped. At the edge of the front yard camera, barely visible in the grainy footage, stood a figure. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could see enough to tell it was a person, a tall, shadowy figure just standing there, staring directly at the camera. They didn't move, didn't wave or signal, just stood perfectly still, their face obscured by a dark hood. My heart began to race, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I kept staring at the screen, waiting for the figure to move, but they didn't. After a few minutes, I closed the laptop, telling myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably nothing. The next morning, I went outside to check if there were any signs of someone being there. Footprints, a discarded jacket, anything. But there was nothing. Just the same empty front yard I'd seen 100 times. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that maybe it was just a trick of the camera, some shadow or glitch. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the figure was closer, standing right at the edge of my front porch. I could see the dark outline of a hood pulled low over their face, concealing their features. But I could feel their gaze fixed on the camera, as if they knew I was watching. My skin crawled as I stared at the screen, waiting for them to move or disappear. I watched, heart pounding, as the minutes ticked by. The figure remained motionless, rooted to the spot, watching. It wasn't until nearly dawn that they finally disappeared, slipping back into the shadows just as the first light began to break through the trees. By this point, my nerves were shot. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning, wondering who could possibly be outside my house at that hour. Part of me wanted to call the police, but what would I tell them? That someone had stood outside my door, staring at a camera? There was nothing they could do with that information. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. I went through the rest of the day in a fog, checking the time constantly, dreading the moment I'd have to check the cameras again. That night, at exactly 3 a.m., I sat at my laptop, hands shaking, and opened the camera feed. And there they were, the figure, back again, standing in the exact same spot as before, hood pulled low, their face hidden in shadow. This time they were closer, almost at the doorstep, and I could see the faint outline of their breath fogging up in the cold night air. I stared at the screen, transfixed, unable to look away. It was as if they were staring straight through the camera, through the screen, directly at me. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, and for the first time since moving in, I felt genuinely afraid. Whoever this was, they weren't just some random stranger wandering around in the middle of the night. They were coming here, night after night, for a reason. And whatever that reason was, I had the sinking feeling it wasn't good. I closed the laptop, heart pounding, and bolted all the doors and windows, double-checking each lock. But even as I lay in bed, every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified, each shadow stretched into something more sinister. The next morning, as the sun crept over the horizon, I went outside, hoping once again to find some trace of them, anything that could explain who they were or what they wanted. But the yard was empty, untouched, as if no one had been there at all. Whatever was happening, it was only just beginning. By the time the next night rolled around, I felt trapped between dread and curiosity. I knew it was probably a terrible idea, but I couldn't resist the pull to check the cameras again. Something about the figure's stillness and their strange fixation on the camera gnawed at me. It was like they were playing a twisted game, daring me to confront whatever horror they were bringing to my doorstep. I spent the entire evening on edge, glancing out the window every few minutes, searching for any sign of movement. The minutes dragged, each one a reminder that soon my visitor would likely be back. When the clock struck midnight, I was wide awake, my nerves stretched thin, my thoughts a mess of fear and morbid anticipation. Finally, at 2:59 a.m., I opened my laptop and clicked into the camera feed for the front porch. My heart raced as the image loaded, my eyes locking onto the screen. And there they were, right on cue, standing at the exact spot they'd occupied the night before, hooded and still as if frozen in time. But this time, they were even closer. The figure was standing directly in front of the door now, mere inches from the camera, head tilted slightly downward as though they were trying to peer through it and into my house. I felt like they could see me, sense my presence on the other side of the screen, and a chill crept through me. There was no way this was a coincidence. No random stranger would stand at my door night after night, at the same hour, without some twisted intent. As I watched, my breathing quickened, and my pulse hammered in my ears. My mind raced with questions. Why were they here? What did they want? Why didn't they try to break in or make any sound? Their silent, eerie presence was almost worse than an outright attack. After a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I snapped my laptop shut, shutting out the sight of the figure, but unable to shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching. Every instinct told me not to go outside, not to confront this unknown threat, but my curiosity was getting the better of me. I had to know what was going on. I decided to look for answers the next morning. There had to be some way to figure out who this person was. Maybe someone in town had seen them, or perhaps it was just a prank, a thought I kept repeating to myself, hoping it would make the situation feel less disturbing. I spent the day going around town, asking a few of the neighbors if they'd noticed anyone unusual in the area, describing the figure as best as I could without sounding too paranoid. But no one had seen anything strange. Most people seemed to think it was just my imagination, some city-born paranoia lingering from my years in the bustling apartment blocks. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew there was someone at my door every night, watching, waiting. And if no one else could see them, that only made the situation feel darker, more twisted. That night, I set my phone to vibrate at 2:50 a.m., determined to see what I could find out if I stayed awake. I wanted to get a clearer look, maybe even catch the figure in the act and confront them, if I dared. I sat at my desk in the living room, phone in hand, staring at the camera feed, the silence around me growing heavier as the minutes ticked by. At 2:59 a.m., my breath caught in my throat as the figure appeared again, just as they had every night before. But this time, they were close enough that I could make out faint details in the dim glow of the porch light. Their hood was pulled low, but beneath it, I could see pale skin, a hint of a face hidden in shadow. The figure's head tilted up slowly, and for the first time I saw their eyes, cold, piercing, and locked directly onto the camera. I was paralyzed, unable to tear my gaze away from the screen. I felt like those eyes were staring straight through the camera, through the walls, and into my very soul. They held a darkness I couldn't comprehend, a void that made every fiber of my being scream in silent terror. And then, as if responding to some unspoken command, the figure began to move. Slowly, deliberately, they raised one hand, fingers pale and thin, and placed it against the glass of my front door, palm pressed flat as though they were feeling for something, or someone. A surge of adrenaline shot through me, and I jumped from my chair, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I knew it was irrational, but I felt like that figure was trying to reach me, like they were on the edge of breaking through the door and stepping into my home. I couldn't stand it any longer. I bolted to the front door, threw open the curtains on the narrow window beside it, and peered outside, expecting to find something. But the porch was empty. The figure had vanished, as if they'd never been there at all. Frantically, I checked the camera feed, but the screen was blank. It was as though the figure had never appeared, like they were some phantom haunting my mind. I stared at the empty porch, struggling to process what I'd just seen. My rational side tried to convince me it was all in my head, a trick of fatigue, but the cold sweat on my skin told me otherwise. I went back to bed, though sleep was the last thing on my mind. Every shadow, every creak of the house seemed to pulse with unseen threat. I lay there, wide awake, knowing that something was out there, waiting, coming back every night for some reason I couldn't begin to understand. And the worst part was, I knew that whatever this was, it wouldn't stop. The next day, I was a wreck. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that face staring back at me, cold and unfeeling. The worst part was the sense of purpose I'd felt from the figure, as if it were only waiting for the right moment to act. I spent the entire day pacing, trying to come up with an explanation, a reason why this was happening to me. Nothing made sense. As the evening approached, I tried to prepare myself for another sleepless night. I couldn't bring myself to check the cameras this time. The fear of seeing those piercing eyes again was too much. Instead, I went through the house, double-checking every lock, closing every curtain. I even turned off the porch light, hoping that maybe darkness would keep the figure at bay. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't make any difference. This thing, whatever it was, didn't seem bound by any of the rules I understood. Around midnight, I finally collapsed onto the couch, trying to convince myself I'd be safe if I just stayed awake. But as the hours crept by, exhaustion took over. I drifted in and out of sleep, my dreams filled with shadowy figures and cold, watchful eyes. I jolted awake around 2:30 a.m., heart racing, the house cloaked in silence. I didn't need to check the time to know it was almost 3 a.m. I debated with myself, fighting the urge to look at the camera feed, knowing that I wouldn't be able to resist. Finally, with a sense of dread, I grabbed my laptop and opened the feed. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, heart pounding, as I clicked into the live view of the front porch. The screen loaded, and there they were, closer than ever, standing right at the door, just inches from the camera. The hooded figure stared directly into the lens, their eyes like two black pits, filled with something beyond anger or malice. It was like they were demanding something, waiting for me to do something I couldn't understand. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the figure raised one hand again, placing it against the glass. But this time, the hand started to push, fingers stretching, pressing harder, as if they were testing the strength of the barrier between us. The glass creaked under the pressure, and I could feel my own heartbeat accelerating, as if it were in sync with the straining glass. The figure's face began to change as it pressed closer to the camera. The shadows shifted, revealing details I hadn't noticed before. A mouth twisted in a cruel, hollow smile, lips cracked and dry, and eyes that seemed to glisten with a dark, unnatural hunger. I felt like I was staring into a void, one that was reaching out, ready to consume me. I closed the laptop, standing abruptly, feeling trapped in my own home. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but I knew there was no one who could save me from this thing. My skin prickled, and every nerve in my body screamed that I needed to get out of there, to escape while I still had the chance. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door, not daring to look out the window as I swung it open. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, and threw myself inside, locking the doors and turning on the engine. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, breathing heavily, glancing back at the house. In the darkness, I could just make out the figure's silhouette through the window, still standing at the door. They watched as I pulled out of the driveway, their presence like a dark stain against the night. I drove without looking back, my only thought to put as much distance as possible between me and that house. I spent the rest of the night at a motel on the edge of town, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the memory of those eyes and that twisted smile. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the sun finally rose, I drove back to the house, hoping that whatever nightmare I'd endured was over, that I'd wake to find everything back to normal. But when I arrived, something caught my eye. On the front porch just outside the door was a single handprint pressed against the glass, smudged and smeared as if someone had dragged their fingers slowly down. My stomach twisted, and I felt a chill settle over me. I approached cautiously, feeling the weight of dread settle over me again. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. And yet the handprint remained, a silent reminder of my visitor. I tried to wipe it off, but the mark wouldn't fade, as if it had somehow seeped into the glass, an imprint left behind by something otherworldly. Over the following days, I struggled to return to any sense of normalcy. I ignored the cameras, too afraid of what I might see if I looked. I kept the curtains drawn, locked every door and window, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every night, as darkness fell, I could feel the presence return, lingering just outside, waiting. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I sold the house and moved back to the city, leaving that nightmare behind. But even now, I can't escape it. I still wake up in the middle of the night, feeling those eyes on me, the weight of that figure's presence pressing in. I never check the cameras anymore, but sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I see a shadow in the doorway, a dark figure standing just out of reach, waiting for me to notice them. And I know, deep down, that wherever I go, they'll be there too, following me, watching, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows once again. Moving into the old Victorian house felt like stepping back in time. It was nestled on the outskirts of town, hidden among towering oaks and pines that whispered secrets in the night. The moment I walked through the creaky front door, I could feel its history, a lifetime of memories trapped within its walls, waiting for someone to listen. For a pianist like me, it was the perfect sanctuary. Here, in the isolation of the woods, I could lose myself in my compositions without interruption. The silence was profound, almost sacred, and the house seemed to understand my need for solitude. Each night, after hours spent hunched over my piano, fingers gliding across the keys, I would sit back, let my hands fall to my lap, and absorb the silence around me. The faint scent of aged wood and dust hung in the air, and occasionally, the floorboards would creak as if the house was settling into sleep along with me. But then, about 2 weeks after moving in, something strange happened. It was just past midnight when I first heard it, a melody drifting faintly through the air, almost like a lullaby. I was sure I was imagining it, a remnant of the music I had been working on moments before. But as I sat still, straining to listen, I realized the sound wasn't coming from the piano. It was coming from somewhere else in the house, as though someone was playing a distant piano just out of reach. The melody was soft, hauntingly beautiful, each note lingering in the air before fading into the next. I froze, heart pounding, as I tried to pinpoint its location. It seemed to drift through the walls, weaving its way around me like an invisible mist. I checked the time, 12:03 a.m. The silence that followed the melody was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat, rapid and unsteady. The next day I brushed it off as a trick of the mind, the result of fatigue and an overactive imagination. But the following night, at exactly midnight, it happened again. This time, the melody was clearer, and I felt an overwhelming urge to find its source. I walked through each room, my footsteps muffled by the thick, worn carpet, but the sound seemed to move with me, always just out of reach. It was as if the house itself were playing the tune. an ethereal symphony that faded the moment I grew too close. Night after night, the melody continued, and it was always the same haunting tune. I found myself growing accustomed to it, almost looking forward to hearing it, as though it were a nightly ritual. But a part of me couldn't ignore the eerie feeling that something was wrong. Each note felt imbued with a sadness that tugged at my chest, a melancholy that seemed to resonate deep within the walls. I tried everything to capture the sound. I left my phone recording overnight, hoping to catch even a snippet of the melody. But each time the recording was blank, as if the music only existed for me in that moment and nowhere else. It made no sense. How could something so real leave no trace? I even set up a small microphone near the piano, but the result was always the same: silence. Over time, the melody grew more intricate, more complex. It no longer sounded like a lullaby, but something darker, more urgent. Chords would shift unexpectedly, breaking the flow, as if the player were agitated, anxious, or perhaps even trying to communicate something. The more I listened, the more I felt as though the music was trying to tell me something, a message hidden within each haunting note. By the end of the second week, sleep had become a distant memory. I found myself lying awake each night, waiting for the clock to strike midnight, waiting for the first note to drift through the air. The house seemed to hold its breath along with me, every creak and groan amplified in the darkness. And then, without fail, the melody would begin again, filling the room with its strange, ghostly beauty. I started spending my days in a haze, too tired to focus, my mind consumed by the mystery of the midnight melody. My own compositions began to reflect it, the haunting notes weaving their way into my music, unbidden and unavoidable. It was as though the melody had taken root inside me, refusing to let go. One night, unable to resist any longer, I decided to search the house thoroughly. I wandered through each room, my footsteps echoing in the stillness as I traced the sound. I checked the empty hallways, the dusty parlor, the quiet corners of the library, but every time I thought I was getting closer, the music seemed to drift away, teasing me with its elusive presence. Finally, I found myself standing in front of a narrow staircase leading up to the attic. I hesitated, feeling a shiver of dread creep over me. I had barely been up there since moving in. There was nothing but old furniture and forgotten relics gathering dust. But something about the melody seemed to pull me upward, a compulsion I couldn't ignore. I climbed the stairs, each creak underfoot echoing like a heartbeat, and pushed open the attic door. The room was bathed in shadows, and a faint, cold draft brushed past me, carrying with it the faintest whisper of the melody. I felt my skin prickle as I stepped forward, my breath catching in my throat. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and decay, and every fiber of my being screamed that I shouldn't be here. But as I stood there, listening to the lingering melody that seemed to fill the attic, I realized with a chill that it sounded like a warning, a dark, foreboding tune that pulsed through the silence, whispering of something horrible yet to come. I couldn't shake the feeling that the melody was trying to tell me something, an uneasy intuition that had settled like a stone in my chest. That night, after my encounter in the attic, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those haunting notes echoing in my mind, their eerie beauty twisting into something darker, almost sinister. The next evening, I sat at my piano, fingers hovering over the keys as I tried to recreate the melody from memory. But the notes eluded me, slipping through my thoughts like water through my fingers. I could only remember fragments, a haunting phrase here, a discordant chord there, but never enough to piece the entire melody together. It was as if the music existed in a realm just beyond my reach, taunting me with its mystery. When midnight approached, I found myself pacing the house, waiting for the melody to begin. There was an odd tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. And then as the clock struck 12, the first note drifted through the darkness, soft and mournful, resonating in the silence. This time, the melody sounded different. There was an urgency to it, a frantic energy that hadn't been there before. Each note felt sharper, more insistent, like a voice rising in panic. My pulse quickened as I listened, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The music seemed to fill every corner of the house, louder than ever, pulsing with a strange life of its own. Driven by a sense of desperation, I grabbed my phone and hit record, holding it up to capture the sound. But as soon as I did, the music faded, slipping back into silence as if it had been nothing more than a figment of my imagination. I checked the recording, but as before, there was nothing, just empty, static silence. My frustration mounted, along with a creeping sense of dread. Why wouldn't it let itself be recorded? Why did it only appear when I was alone, with no proof left behind? I spent the next day in a daze, my mind clouded by exhaustion and an unshakable feeling of unease. I wandered through the house, feeling as though I were intruding in my own home. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the shadows, seemed to carry an unseen presence. And always, in the back of my mind, the melody lingered, threading through my thoughts like a dark, inescapable current. By the time night fell again, I was teetering on the edge of fear and obsession. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was happening, what this melody wanted from me. As the clock neared midnight, I positioned myself near the attic stairs, feeling my heart pound with anticipation. If the music returned, I would follow it to its source, no matter where it led me. When the first note drifted through the air, I felt a chill run down my spine. The melody had returned, softer this time, almost coaxing, as if inviting me to follow. I took a deep breath and climbed the stairs, the music guiding me upward, each note seeming to grow louder as I ascended. The attic door loomed before me, its wood cracked and weathered, as if worn down by the weight of years. I pushed it open and stepped inside, feeling the temperature drop instantly. The room was as I'd left it, filled with shadows and the scent of old wood. But now the melody was everywhere, vibrating through the air, so close I felt I could almost reach out and touch it. It was coming from the far corner, where a small, covered mirror stood, hidden beneath a heavy cloth that looked as though it hadn't been moved in decades. My hand shook as I reached for the cloth, hesitating as an instinctive dread took hold. But the music grew louder, insistent, pressing me to continue. I pulled the cloth away, revealing an ornate mirror, its surface covered in a layer of dust. My own reflection stared back at me, distorted and ghostly in the dim light. And yet as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. My reflection wasn't alone. Behind me, just out of focus, was a shadowy figure, standing in the corner of the room. I whipped around, heart racing, but there was no one there, only the empty, silent room, filled with shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in the flickering light. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone, leaving only my pale, shaken reflection staring back at me. I took a step back, clutching my chest as I tried to steady my breathing. The melody had faded, but its echo lingered in the silence, filling the room with an unsettling energy. I stumbled back down the stairs, feeling as though I'd intruded upon something ancient and dangerous. The house felt different now, darker, as though a hidden presence had been watching me all along. I could feel it in the walls, in the creak of the floorboards, in the cold draft that seemed to seep through every crack and corner. The next day, I found an old trunk hidden in the corner of the attic, buried beneath a pile of forgotten boxes. Inside, I discovered a collection of sheet music, yellowed and brittle with age. Most of the pieces were incomplete, filled with faded notes and scribbled annotations. But one piece in particular caught my eye. It was a fragment of the same melody I had been hearing each night, written in a delicate, flowing hand that seemed almost familiar. I felt a surge of excitement, mixed with fear. This was a clue, a tangible connection to the music that haunted me. But as I studied the notes, a realization crept over me, a warning hidden in the twisted harmonies and strange intervals. The melody wasn't just a song, it was a message, a desperate plea from someone, or something lost to time. That night, as I lay in bed, the melody returned, darker and more intense than ever. I could feel it vibrating through the walls, pulsing with a frantic energy that seemed to thrum in time with my own heartbeat. The music was building, rising to a crescendo, as if it were on the verge of revealing its terrible secret. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that something dreadful was about to happen, and I was helpless to stop it. By the time midnight approached again, every nerve in my body was on edge. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down into a darkness that threatened to pull me in. The melody had become an obsession, filling my thoughts even during the day. I couldn't escape it, It haunted me, a constant reminder that something awaited me each night, something that was growing closer, more desperate, with every passing moment. I sat in my living room, watching the clock as it ticked toward midnight. The air felt charged, heavy with an unseen presence. Shadows seemed to stretch and shift around me, moving in ways that defied the faint light from the single lamp I'd left on. I tried to brace myself, taking deep, shaky breaths as I waited for the first note. At exactly 12, the melody began, louder and more intense than ever before. The notes crashed through the silence, echoing off the walls, filling every corner of the house. I felt them vibrating through the floor, a deep, reverberating sound that seemed to pulse with an energy that was almost alive. My chest tightened, and I knew, without a doubt, that this was the final warning. Driven by a sense of urgency, I moved toward the attic, the melody pulling me forward like a force I couldn't resist. Each step felt heavier than the last, my heart racing with a mixture of fear and determination. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated, feeling a chill seep into my bones as I placed my hand on the doorknob. I opened the door and stepped inside, my eyes scanning the shadowed room. The mirror stood in the corner, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light, as if beckoning me closer. The melody filled the attic, so loud now that it felt like it was coming from within me, echoing in my mind, vibrating through every fiber of my being. I approached the mirror, drawn by an invisible force, my reflection barely visible through the layer of dust that coated the glass. But as I got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My reflection didn't match my movements. It stood still, watching me with eyes that were wide, terrified, almost pleading. And then, slowly, it raised a hand, pressing it against the inside of the glass, as if trying to break free. I stumbled back, heart racing, as the music swelled to a deafening crescendo. I could feel the air around me grow colder, the shadows deepening, closing in on me. My reflection began to distort, its features twisting and shifting, morphing into something unrecognizable, something wrong. A dark, shadowy figure appeared behind it, its outline barely discernible, like a shape carved from the darkness itself. It reached forward, placing its hands on my reflection's shoulders, pulling it back into the shadows. I watched, frozen in horror, as my reflection struggled, its mouth open in a silent scream, before it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the darkness within the mirror. The melody reached its peak, the notes crashing together in a cacophony of sound that made my ears ring. I clutched my head, closing my eyes, trying to block out the noise, but it was relentless, pounding through my mind, filling me with a terror that went beyond anything I'd ever felt. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the music stopped. Silence filled the room, thick and oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight. I opened my eyes, staring at the mirror, my heart pounding as I took in the empty surface. My reflection was gone. The glass was dark, empty, as though it had swallowed me whole. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind struggled to make sense of what I'd just witnessed, but the fear held me captive, rooted to the spot. I stumbled back, my gaze still fixed on the mirror, half expecting to see my own face staring back at me, twisted in terror. But there was nothing. I turned and ran, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the empty house as I fled down the stairs. I didn't stop until I reached the front door, throwing it open and stepping out into the cold night air. I could barely breathe, my chest tight with a mix of fear and disbelief. I stared back at the house, its windows dark and empty, as if it were watching me, as if it had been waiting for this all along. The melody was gone, but its echo lingered in my mind, a faint, haunting refrain that would never leave me. In the days that followed, I tried to move on, to forget the horror that had consumed me. But I could feel the house's presence lingering, watching, waiting. And every night, as midnight approached, I felt a chill creep over me, a reminder that the melody would return. It was a warning, a message from something that existed beyond the boundaries of our world, something that had found me and would never let me go. I left the house soon after, but the melody followed me. I hear it sometimes, faint and distant, drifting through the air like a ghostly whisper. It calls to me, beckoning, reminding me that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Moving to the top floor of the old isolated building seemed like a perfect choice. After years of living in busy city apartments, constantly surrounded by noise, I was ready for something quieter, somewhere I could truly be alone. The building itself was an oddity, tall and narrow, tucked away on the edge of town, as if hiding from view. Its architecture was outdated, almost Gothic, with narrow windows and dark brick walls that seemed to absorb all light. From the moment I set foot in the place, there was a palpable stillness that clung to the air, as though the building held its breath. It was exactly the kind of atmosphere I had been looking for. The top floor was mine alone, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood or the faint hum of distant pipes. No sounds from neighbors, no traffic noise, nothing but the quiet solitude I'd craved. The other tenants were as peculiar as the building itself. I rarely saw them, and when I did, they barely acknowledged me. They moved quickly, always looking straight ahead, as though they had somewhere urgent to be. Once or twice, I tried to greet them in passing, but they would avoid eye contact, nodding curtly or ignoring me altogether. I brushed it off at first, assuming they were just private people who kept to themselves. After all, I'd chosen this place for the same reason. But then, I noticed something strange. Every time I left my apartment and walked down the hall, people would take the stairs instead of the elevator to avoid coming up to the top floor. Even the maintenance workers seemed hesitant, rarely showing up and only entering my floor when absolutely necessary. They would hurry through their tasks, casting nervous glances at the walls and doors before quickly making their way back downstairs. It was as if the top floor was cursed, and they wanted nothing to do with it. Curiosity began to gnaw at me, tugging at the edges of my thoughts. I started paying closer attention, trying to catch any whispered conversations or hushed comments about my floor. But the silence remained, thick and impenetrable. The building itself seemed complicit, its walls holding on to secrets that no one was willing to share. One evening, after a particularly quiet day, I decided to explore the hallway outside my apartment. I'd noticed that the layout was slightly odd. Long, narrow corridors with abrupt turns that led to seemingly random doors and nooks. The lighting was dim, with a faint, yellowish hue that gave everything a sickly tint. As I walked, my footsteps echoed softly, the only sound in the otherwise silent building. I reached the end of the corridor and found a door I hadn't noticed before. It was almost hidden, blending into the wall as though it were trying to go unnoticed. A faint layer of dust coated the doorknob, as if no one had touched it in years. I felt a strange sense of hesitation, but my curiosity overpowered the unease. I reached out, turned the doorknob, and pulled it open. Behind the door was a narrow passage that led deeper into the building. The air inside was cold and stale, and the dim light barely penetrated the shadows ahead. I hesitated, glancing back toward my apartment. A part of me wanted to close the door and leave, to return to the comfort of my quiet solitude. But the urge to see what lay beyond was too strong. I stepped into the passage, letting the door click shut behind me. The corridor stretched on endlessly, with walls that seemed to close in the further I walked. Doors lined the hallway at irregular intervals, each one closed and unmarked, giving no indication of what lay behind them. I walked slowly, my fingers brushing against the rough, cold walls, feeling a strange sense of anticipation growing within me. The silence was deeper here, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were listening. After what felt like an eternity, I stopped in front of one of the doors, my hand hovering over the doorknob. A faint chill crept over me, but I pushed it aside, gripping the handle and twisting it open. The room was empty, its walls bare and its floor coated in a thin layer of dust. But as I stepped inside, a movement caught my eye. In the far corner, partially hidden by shadows, was a figure. It was hard to make out any details. Their features were obscured, blurred by the dim light. They stood perfectly still, facing me, watching in silence. I felt a prickle of fear, but something kept me rooted to the spot, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stared with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I backed out of the room, closing the door slowly, my heart pounding as I stumbled back into the corridor. The walls seemed to press in closer, the air thick and heavy. I glanced down the hall, half expecting to see another figure standing there, watching, but the corridor was empty, stretching out in silent anticipation. I retraced my steps, my mind racing with questions. Who was that figure? Why had they been standing there so silent and still? And why did the entire building seem designed to hide such unsettling secrets? When I returned to my apartment, I locked the door and sat in the quiet, trying to calm my nerves. But the feeling of being watched lingered, a constant weight pressing down on me. I told myself I would stay away from that corridor, that I'd forget about the figure in the shadows. But deep down, I knew the mystery wouldn't let me go. I had seen something I wasn't meant to see, and the building wouldn't let me forget it. The feeling of unease clung to me long after I left that hidden room. I spent the next few days trying to convince myself that I had imagined the figure, that maybe it was just a trick of the light or my mind playing games in the dimness. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled upon something wrong. The building seemed different now. What once felt like peaceful isolation now felt like something darker. The walls seemed to close in around me, and every shadow seemed to hold secrets. Even the air felt heavier, thick with something unspoken. The other tenants continued to avoid me, their movements quick and furtive. If I happened to catch one in the hallway, they would look away, as if afraid to acknowledge my presence. I started to wonder if they knew something I didn't, if they were aware of the secrets hidden in the walls. My curiosity only grew. Every night, I would lie awake, my thoughts drifting back to that hidden passageway, the endless corridor, and the figure in the shadows. It felt like the building was calling me, urging me to explore deeper, to uncover whatever secrets it held. I tried to resist, to ignore the pull, but each night, as the quiet settled around me, the urge became stronger. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Late one night, I slipped out of my apartment, drawn to the hidden door like a moth to a flame. The hallway was empty, the silence almost oppressive as I made my way down the dimly lit corridor. I found the door exactly as I'd left it, nearly invisible, blending seamlessly into the wall. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding, but the curiosity was too strong to ignore. I opened the door and stepped inside. The passage was as cold and dark as before, stretching out endlessly before me. I walked slowly, each step echoing in the silence. As I moved deeper into the corridor, I began to notice faint whispers, so soft they were almost indistinguishable from the hum of the building. It sounded like people talking, but the words were jumbled, nonsensical, like an old radio barely tuned into a distant station. The whispers grew louder as I approached another door. This one was slightly ajar, and a faint light seeped through the crack, casting a thin beam across the dusty floor. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, pushing it open with a creak that echoed through the silence. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with strange symbols, painted in what looked like faded ink. The floor was covered in old, tattered papers, their edges yellowed with age. In the center of the room stood an old wooden table, and on it, a single candle flickered weakly, casting dancing shadows across the walls. But it was the object beside the candle that caught my attention, a small, intricately carved box. I stepped closer, drawn to the box as if under a spell. The carvings were strange, twisting patterns that seemed to shift and move in the flickering candlelight. I reached out, my fingers hovering above the lid, hesitating. But just as I was about to touch it, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, and a whisper, clearer than the rest, filled the air. "Don't." I froze, my hand retracting as I looked around the room. The shadows seemed to shift, moving in ways that defied the flickering light. I felt as if I were being watched, 100 unseen eyes staring at me from the corners of the room. My heart pounded, and I took a step back, but something compelled me to stay, to keep looking. I heard footsteps from outside the room, soft but unmistakable, as if someone were pacing in the hallway. I turned, peering through the crack in the door, and saw a shadow pass by, a figure moving slowly, deliberately. They stopped in front of the door, their head turned slightly, as if listening. My breath caught, and I backed away, pressing myself against the wall, hoping they wouldn't see me. The figure stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching, thick and tense. Then, without a word, they continued down the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't dare move until I was sure they were gone. When I finally gathered the courage to leave, I slipped out of the room, careful to close the door behind me. The hallway was empty, the silence heavy once more. I walked back to my apartment, my footsteps quick and light, my pulse still racing. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following me, but the corridor remained empty. Back in my apartment, I locked the door and collapsed onto the couch, my mind racing with questions. Who was that figure? And why had they been standing outside the room, watching, waiting? The strange symbols, the whispers, the shadowy figures, it was as if the building were alive, holding secrets it was reluctant to reveal. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dimly lit room, the strange symbols, and the figure in the hallway. I could still feel the cold breeze, hear the whispered warning echoing in my mind. Don't. What did it mean? What was I not supposed to find? In the days that followed, I tried to push the experience out of my mind, to return to my routine and ignore the pull of the hidden corridors. But the curiosity wouldn't leave me. It gnawed at me, a constant reminder that there was more to discover, more secrets hidden within the building's walls. And then one night, I heard it, a soft, faint knocking coming from the hidden door in the hallway. It was barely audible, but unmistakable, a rhythmic tapping that echoed through the silence. I sat up, heart pounding, listening as the knocking continued, each tap like a heartbeat, calling me back to the corridor. The building was calling to me, its secrets whispering through the walls, urging me to uncover what lay hidden within its depths. And I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The knocking continued, faint yet persistent, each tap like a whispered invitation I couldn't ignore. I sat on the edge of my bed, heart pounding, my mind racing with thoughts of the hidden corridors, the strange symbols, and the shadowy figures that seemed to haunt every corner of the building. I knew I shouldn't go back, that every instinct was warning me to stay away. But the knocking wouldn't stop, as if the building itself were calling me, urging me to discover whatever lay within its walls. Finally, unable to resist, I got up and stepped into the hallway. The air felt colder than usual, the dim lights casting long shadows that seemed to reach out as I walked past. The hidden door was exactly where I'd left it, slightly ajar, as though waiting for me. The knocking stopped the moment I stepped inside, replaced by an eerie silence that settled over me like a shroud. I took a deep breath and began walking down the corridor, the walls pressing in as the darkness deepened. The hallway stretched on endlessly, twisting and turning, each step leading me further from the familiar and into something darker, something that felt wrong. As I moved deeper, I felt a growing unease, a sense of being watched. My footsteps echoed, the sound bouncing off the walls in a way that made the corridor seem even more oppressive, as though it were swallowing me whole. Eventually, I came to a door at the very end of the corridor, different from the others I had seen. This door was taller, its wood dark and worn, with strange symbols carved into its surface. I hesitated, feeling a chill crawl up my spine, but the pull was too strong. I reached out and twisted the knob, pushing the door open. The room beyond was vast, much larger than it should have been, with high ceilings and walls covered in mirrors that reflected my image back at me from every angle. The reflections seemed distorted, twisted, as though they were mocking my presence. I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me with a soft click, sealing me in. I turned, my gaze moving over the walls, over the mirrors that showed countless versions of myself, each one watching with an intensity that made my skin crawl. In the center of the room, a group of figures stood in silence, their faces obscured by shadows, their bodies still as statues. They wore dark, heavy clothing, their features hidden beneath hoods, but I could feel their eyes on me, their silent, unblinking gaze piercing through the dimness. I took a step forward, my heart hammering as I approached them. The silence was thick, oppressive, filling the space with an unbearable weight. The figures didn't move, didn't react, just continued to watch, as if waiting for me to make the first move. Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible in the vast emptiness. For a moment there was no response, only the heavy silence pressing down on me. Then, one of the figures took a slow, deliberate step forward, their hood falling back to reveal a face that was disturbingly familiar. It was me. I stared, frozen, as my own face looked back at me, its eyes cold and empty, a twisted reflection of myself. The other figures stepped forward, their hoods falling to reveal identical faces, each one a warped version of me, with expressions that ranged from blank indifference to a sinister smile. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, my heart racing as I tried to process what I was seeing. The room seemed to shift, the mirrors reflecting countless versions of myself, each one trapped, lost in the endless corridors of the building. I turned, searching for an escape, but the door had vanished, replaced by another mirror that showed me standing alone, surrounded by shadows. I ran, desperate to escape, my footsteps echoing as I stumbled through the maze of mirrors and reflections. The figures followed, their footsteps silent, their gazes locked onto me as I twisted and turned, trying to find a way out. Every door I opened led to another hallway, another endless corridor filled with shadows and whispers that echoed in my mind. Finally, I found myself back in the main corridor, my apartment door looming at the end. I sprinted toward it, my breath ragged, my heart pounding, the echoes of footsteps close behind me. I reached the door and threw it open, stumbling inside and slamming it shut behind me. Silence. I leaned against the door, chest heaving, my mind reeling from what I had seen. But as I looked around, I realized something was wrong. The walls of my apartment seemed darker, the shadows deeper, as if the building itself had changed. And in the corner, reflected in the glass of the window, I saw them, the figures, standing just outside, watching me with those cold, unblinking eyes. I backed away, my mind racing as I tried to comprehend what was happening. But no matter where I turned, I couldn't escape their gaze. Every mirror, every reflective surface in the apartment showed them standing behind me, their silent presence filling every corner of my vision. It was then that I understood. I had gone too far. I had uncovered something I was never meant to see, something that could never be forgotten. The building's secrets had claimed me, and there was no escape. The figures closed in, their reflections surrounding me, a silent, endless procession of twisted versions of myself. And as the darkness closed in, I felt the walls of the building wrap around me, pulling me into its depths, where I would join the countless others who had been lost to its secrets.